I think now we can start. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the first working session of the Latin American SDEWES conference. It is my great pleasure to introduce the keynote speaker, Professor Ingo Stadler, who is Managing Director of the Cologne Institute for Renewable Energy SDEWES of Technical University of Köln. Within the institute, he covers the areas of renewable energies and energy economics. Dr. Stadler is working since many years with the topic of electricity supply systems with high share of renewables. And among others, he investigates demand response activities and non-electric energy storage devices in order to decouple electricity generation and consumption. Also, I would like to elaborate a little more on Ingo's relation to Brazil. So he came to Brazil first time in 1996 for a cooperation with University of Curitiba and Fortaleza, and especially the cooperation with the Federal University of Ceará in Fortaleza. It is still ongoing, and up to now the universities have exchanged more than 80 students on both sides. Also, Ingo has been giving a touch to a Brazilian energy policy and regulation. And in the years between 2010 and 2013, Ingo had a close cooperation with the regulatory body of Brazil, ANEEL. So together they developed the regulation for net metering and on how distributed generation systems might be connected to the public grid. And in that framework, he also cooperated with EP in Rio de Janeiro, had many talks with electricity companies like Light from Rio de Janeiro, Ampala in Niterói, and their organizations. So I don't want to take too much time. I would like now to invite Ingo to present his lecture today and to elaborate his views on what makes the fear of change in the energy sector. Ingo, please, the floor is yours.
Hello and welcome to the first Latin American SDEWES conference. Bom dia. I'm very pleased that I have the opportunity here to speak in the opening session in the city that I love most worldwide. It's really a pleasure to do so. Can I have the slides here on the... The conference is a very international one. Nevertheless, I decided here now today to speak about a very national perspective of the energy transition. And the reason for that is wherever I come worldwide, the people always say, you in Germany, you're so advanced in integrating the renewable energy systems or renewable energy resources into energy and electricity systems. And I sometimes wonder, even here in Brazil, they say the same thing. Even Brazil always had much more renewable electricity and other renewables in other energy sectors, like in the cooling sector and also in the mobility sector. So then I ask, why are you saying Germany is advanced? Then they answer, but the new renewables, there you are more advanced in integrating those volatile solar and wind energy in your systems. And maybe that was true until maybe 5 to 6 years ago, but never the people really see this change that we had in our country, and maybe that experience is worth sharing with those countries nowadays are much more advanced than our country is. And I use those stages of change. I like a citation of Mahatma Gandhi when he says, first they ignore you. And that maybe was in the 90s when me and other students had the idea of using solar energy. Our professors, they just ignored us and thought we are stupid guys. Maybe that is also a message to all students here. When you have new ideas and your professors say that's nonsense, don't believe in professors, sometimes they are very wrong. And then they laugh at you. And that was maybe the story in Germany until the year 2011. We had an enormous boom in renewable generation, and the old energy industry, they just laughed. They didn't see the risk on their business when we integrate a lot of renewables. And then there's the next stage, then they fight you. And maybe that is the story in our country of the last 5 to 6 years. And at the moment we have a horrible battle on the old energy economy and the new energy economy, on prosperous politicians and conservative politicians, and also on the people who want to go for renewables and others who want to stay where it is. And that is the reason why I named my talk today The Fear of Change. And maybe on that photo we can see maybe that guy that could be a coal guy from the coal industry the first time sees how powerful solar energy could be. I structured my talk first in the fear of going ahead. So do we need a global solution? Second, the fear of losing jobs. The third, no fear of lies. And fourth, fear to remove man-made regulations. And fifth, fear of losses in the old car industry. And sixth, the fear of finishing climate hazardous subsidies. And SDEWES, disculpa, I never can stop making bad jokes about the World Cup in 2014, but it's mostly the Brazilians who always talk about that SDEWES. And I will finish my talk with the German Taliban. I start with the fear of going ahead. So we started very good with renewables. And the global problems, for sure, global warming is a global problem and it needs a global solution. That's very clear. But on the same, it's a very good excuse for not taking action on a regional or on a national level. So the best argument we hear for years, we should not go ahead because that's a global problem. We cannot solve that on a national basis. And then they argue, we already have the proof that works on a global basis. We had that problem with the ozone hole in the 90s, and that could be solved on a global level. And when we remember what did we do when we had the ozone hole problem, of course there was an enormous resistance from the halocarbon industry not to produce the halocarbons anymore. Then there was the Montreal Convention where the participants agreed to freeze the production of CFCs at the 1986 levels, and then later 2000 to stop with the CFC production. But all the major companies worldwide, like today the coal industry for example, they claim that there are no alternatives for HFC. And then there was the first ozone-safe hydrocarbon refrigerant development, and quite surprisingly it was the NGO Greenpeace who has given the patent on green freeze, and they let the patent as open source. And then more and more the CFCs, refrigerants, had been forbidden worldwide. And for example, in 2004 in Brazil, the production of ozone-safe refrigerator production started like in all countries in the world. So should we go for the global solution also in the global warming problem? I see a significant difference in that. And when we compare those two, the CFC refrigerators, they had been an enormous business worldwide. It's the same like the oil, coal and gas industry is a fantastic business. And then, of course, there was a big resistance towards a change both in the ozone killing elements as in the global warming problem like coal, natural gas and oil. So there had been fights, and then on the left side we have an international agreement on getting rid of the ozone problem in the energy. We still have fights and battles. And then finally all companies, I don't know if they really agreed, but they had been forced finally to get rid of the ozone hazardous materials, but in the energy sector we go on fighting. And what is maybe the reason? And in my opinion the reason is the players in the refrigeration business remain the same. So the old refrigeration producers also produce the new refrigerators, even they need to change their business. But when we look to the energy sector, the players will be exchanged. It will definitely not be the same anymore, and therefore we cannot expect that it's just a global agreement going towards renewables. And I want to highlight that only on one example. When we look for the old economy, the coal, maybe the coal is produced somewhere in Australia, so it's an open cast mining business. Then it is shipped in a global logistics process around the world. Maybe it is then stored in the Rotterdam harbor in large quantities, and then it's distributed via trains or smaller ships to the power stations in the different countries. And then we have big centralized power stations, coal-fired power station, steam power stations. And when we now look how, for example, the solar business looks like, there we have a silicon industry, we have a photovoltaic cell and module industry, we have a lot of power electronic industries, and then we have a mass of installers needing to put all the equipment into the field, onto the roofs and the fields, and finally we have a decentralized generation system. And those two players will definitely not be the same. So we have on the left side a resource-based energy system, a centralized one. On the right side we have a technology-based, decentralized one. And those businesses are completely different, and also those who will have the profit of those systems are different, and therefore I'm sure there will not be a consensus on going to energy transition. When I just look here on that slide, that is unfortunately not too actual, but it shows that Germany spends almost 100 billion euros every year to import oil, gas and coal products. And this 100 billion euros is a big business, not only for the oil exporting countries, but also for those who import those resources. They profit a lot from those imports, and they will not give up their business just without fighting for that. And that is the situation in which we are. The climate conferences had already been mentioned, that it started here in Rio de Janeiro in 1992. And I have a very bad opinion on climate conferences, maybe different from others here in the room. Then that continued in Johannesburg. Then we had the famous Kyoto Protocol with not really a benefit for the world. We continued in Bali and in many other cities like Copenhagen. Then we went to Doha and many other places, and then it came the very famous Paris document. And I remember when François Hollande said, "Today we achieved the most beautiful and most peaceful revolution." Or the former Ministry of Foreign Affairs, John Kerry for the United States, "That is a victory for everybody on the planet and for future generations." And then I thought, wow, now I need to read that document. And then I read it, and I was really disappointed. I would say it's not worth the paper it's written on. And again, you might have a different opinion on that. But what do you find there? They say the global warming should be kept well below 2 degrees. The rich countries must provide $100 billion starting from 2020. But why 2020 starting? Why not immediately? Because they couldn't agree, and 2020 had been quite far away. The developed countries must continue to take the lead with reducing greenhouse gases. The developed countries never reduce greenhouse gases. They always produce more and more, so it's not possible to continue to take the lead. And the developing countries are encouraged to enhance their efforts. the greenhouse gas emission should reach its maximum as soon as possible. I thought we should decrease it, but they have the aim to reach the maximum as soon as possible. And then within 50-50, the balance of the carbon emission should be equal or zero. And I really wish everybody a long and healthy life, but those people who decided that a few years ago, by far will not be living anymore when they have taken decision for the year 2050. So I'm not really very positive that we have a good result from Paris. And that's why my opinion is we need other arguments for energy transition. It cannot be only the global warming or the climate change. I don't see a possibility that we come to a consensus on going here uniquely worldwide. I think we need more egoism in going for the energy transition, and that could be an increasing energy autarky, and also, for example, job creation is a very big argument. Worldwide, only in a few countries, that is not so a big argument, and decentralized energy generation always is a big job creator. So I would like to talk about the fear of jobs, and I start that sometimes science is just used for disinformation or science is misused. I remember the Copenhagen Climate Conference, and just a few days before they take a decision there, in Germany the coal industry announced the results of a prognosis study, and they said when we go for more strong climate policy, we will lose 55,000 jobs and the national economy will decrease by 17 billion euro. And I, as an engineer, was asking myself, how can they determine that 55,000 jobs are lost? And then I really started to read those ugly documents, a few hundred pages thick, and I really was surprised because on page 39 they just write, we only investigated how many jobs will be lost. We didn't investigate how many will be created by renewable energy, by environmental industry. But what media, television station, radio station, and industry organization communicated was just a big loss of job and a big loss of money. That was the job development on renewable energy in Germany. And we see there was a peak in the year 2012 where we really had 400,000 jobs in the renewable business. That was really fantastic, but you also can see it then decreased. Worldwide, the jobs and installations are increasing. In Germany, now it decreased. And that is the same information, or only a bit more detailed, giving the job information on different technologies. And it was on a 400,000 jobs peak. But then what we are discussing nowadays is just only the jobs we will lose in the coal industry, in the lignite industry. And like we see here in the television station contribution and the newspaper contribution, that is 20,000 jobs. For sure 20,000 jobs is a lot, but compared to what we have in renewable, it's almost nothing. So when we compare the coal job there, it's just a small part. And for example, only what we lost in the PV sector within 3 years, that had been 70,000 jobs, but nobody talks about the 70,000 jobs in solar industry, but everybody talks about the 20,000 jobs in coal industry. And that I learned, I thought when we had that massive jobs in renewables, nobody will touch renewables anymore. But what we learned in school, that is the commutative law that is always valid. So we learned that A times B is the same like B times A. And that is not valid in politics. So I learned when there are 10,000 jobs per enterprise and we have 10 enterprises, a politician is doing everything to save the jobs in that industry because he will be the hero, good press in front of that many workers. And it's completely different when you have 10 jobs per enterprise, but you have that in 10,000 enterprises. Nobody cares when the installer of a PV system or the installer of wind turbines lose their jobs. It's just not reported in press and no politician will take care about that. And there are very strong trade unions in the centralized energy systems. So when they have demonstrations, sometimes I have the impression there are more people on the street than really working in that business. So they are much better organized than those decentralized small companies, but having much more jobs, and we lost much more jobs in that. And I continue with no fear of lies, and that is maybe my favorite topic. My research is mainly in energy storage, and permanently everybody says we have a storage problem, wind and solar need storage, and we don't have the proper storage solution, so we cannot go for renewables anymore. And I would like to get some reports from dangerous embracements. Sometimes I sit on podiums like that with conservative politicians or with coal people, and then I'm already ready for fighting with them. But what they are doing, it seems to be laugh what they want to do. They, for example, start talking, we need to make a lot of research in energy storage. We need to get a lot of money for laboratories of Ingo and other researchers. And I thought, wow, how can I have a different opinion than they have? But then I see it's not really love. It is more an embracement, one of the Klitschko brothers, because what they say when they say we need to invest in research, they say we should not go for renewables anymore. The next 10, 20 years we go for research and storage, and then maybe we continue 10 or 20 years later. The unsolved storage problem, or I also would like to say, is chasing another pig through the village. And there always had been lies coming from the old energy business. And when I have this race of the two pigs here, the pig with the number 5, that was more than a decade the best pig we had in the country, and that was we need base load. Solar and wind cannot do base load power generation. That's the reason why forever we need coal power station and nuclear power stations. Nowadays it's even for everybody clear, not maybe in the state where I come from, but that base load is not needed. Even base load power stations do not fit to renewable power generation. So that pig is now dead, but we now have a new pig, and that is the pig with the number 2 taking over the lead, and that is we have the unsolved storage problem. And then it's a difficult situation when somebody offers you money for research, and I like always to take all the money I can get. On the other side, I would like to argue we have all the storages that we need for energy transition. And then a long time was thinking, how could I explain that? And I found a good picture in the role of man giving birth to a child. Not in making children, I'm sure you more like to discuss on the process of making children, but it's on the process of giving birth to a child. And in Germany quite often say the only role of man when he has a pregnant wife, when it's close to birth, he takes his car, puts the wife into the car and drives her to the hospital. That's the only role of man. There's not another one. And when I go back to the year 1970, that supermodel here on the car, that's myself together with my mother. And my father was very proud of having that car. And I could say there are no safety belts, no head cushions, no airbags. And from a today perspective, you would ask, is the motor power sufficient to reach the hospital? So, but from a 1970 perspective, it was not a problem to drive a pregnant woman to the hospital. When I take that to the energy storage discussion, maybe one could say when we talk about 2050 on energy storages, we will see, wow, in 2018, they had awful expensive storages, they have inefficient storages, but nevertheless, like we could drive to a hospital in the 1970s, nowadays we have all the storages we need for energy transition. And the conservative energy expert might have said in the 1970s, oh, it's impossible bearing children today, we should wait until the year 2018 until we have the car generation that we know today. It's much too dangerous going for having children in 1970s. In case you think I'm too aggressive here, I think the reason is my first years I needed to live in that ugly, aggressive red car here. That makes me maybe quite aggressive. So I would say the storage problem is solved. It is just a lie that is putting forward not going to more renewables. And so that is quite a good illustration. Can see we don't have appropriate energy storage, but when you stand on the line, you cannot plug it into the system. By the way, now it's the commercial part of my talk. With a colleague, I have written a quite thick book on energy storages, and with many Brazilian students coming to my university, we have translated that into Portuguese. But unfortunately, so far, we didn't find the Brazilian publisher wanting to publish that book in Portuguese here in the country. So when you have any relationship for that, I would be glad when I could have your help. Another thing, what I get in a presentation of a coal guy, he said, yes, energy transition is very good, but it's much too fast. We need to go slower. And he was using a citation of Mario Andretti, a former Formula 1 pilot. If everything seems under control, you're just not going fast enough. Meaning we are just too fast in energy transition, we need to go slower, else we lose control. I want to answer there is something even more dangerous than going too fast, and that is when you're going in the wrong direction, it's much more dangerous than driving fast with your car. So quite often those people speak with split tongues. And then another favorite topic of mine is the coupling of different energy sectors. And I try to explain why the coupling of electricity, heating, cooling, transport is of importance. And we see that maybe that's not true for Brazil because you have immense storage capacity in your hydro system, but in many countries we don't have storage in the electricity system, or not too much. In the mobility sector, we have a lot of storage systems. All those massive number of cars, you cannot imagine that they are grid connected. That would be a mess when every car would take a cable behind of it. Impossible to imagine, but it's a different type of storage. It's not electrical storage, it's fuel storage or gas storage. And also in the heating sector, storage is very normal. For example, every boiler room looks like that with a heating storage. Even we use oil and gas for producing the heat. Even in solar system, it's clear we need a storage, a hot water storage for covering the night when there is no sun. And even when we have a grid-connected heating system, a district heating system, we use energy storages in the houses. So in the heating sector, storages is a very normal thing. Also that should be named the gas sector. Also in the gas sector, energy storages is a very normal thing, although gas is a grid-connected energy carrier. And I try to explain why is it so different in the electricity sector. And I created that strange indicator. I put the cost of a kilowatt hour discharged from a storage and put that in relation to the cost of transmitting 1 megawatt per meter. And when I do that for the electrical system, we get here a number something between 10 and 100. In the gas sector, it's only between 1 and 10. And in the heating sector, it's even much smaller. It's only 0.01 to 0.1. So energy storage in different sectors are much cheaper than in electricity sector. For mobility, transmission system does not make really sense. And they put another indicator, and that is the cost of a kilowatt hour discharged from the storage again in relation to the generation capacity cost. And I start again with the electricity sector, and then we end up in the complete upper right area. So again, here electricity in storage in relation to generation is a very expensive thing. The gas sector does not make sense here in the generation of gas, but in the heating system again, the storage is much cheaper as it is in electricity 10 to 100. In heating, it is just around 0.001. And when I put that for gasoline storage in relation to the motor power, then it is just something around 0.000001. So there we see storage in electricity is not a really good thing to go. It makes everything expensive. And here on that slide, we have here on the horizontal the volumetric energy density of different energy storages. And on the vertical, we have the efficiency of storages. And the volume of those circles gives the investment costs of a storage system. And then we see the pure electrical storage, like capacitors, they are enormous expensive, so we should not discuss them using in electricity systems. All the battery systems, they have a wide spread on energy densities, but the balls are still quite big, so they are still quite expensive. When we look for the mechanical storages, like we have here the pumped hydro, that is already a quite small circle, and that is the reason why pumped hydro is applied so much worldwide. But now coming to the heating sector, and there are different heating storages, but for example, the sensitive, just a hot water tank, you almost cannot see that dot. Hot water storage is so cheap, then we can solve the problem on the heating sector. It's much better than solving it in the electricity sector. And then we have the gas storage, either hydrogen or methane. And again, here you almost cannot see those dots. Again, a very cheap way to store, but here the expensive thing is the conversion technology producing hydrogen or the methane. So we can resume, we need to use the cheap storages of heating, gas and mobility sector in order to solve the storage tasks in the electricity sector. And that is when we are talking on coupling different sectors. When we start with the electricity sector, of course, we have electricity storages. In the heat, we have heat storages. We have gas storages in the gas sector. We also can store raw materials of the chemical industry. And in the mobility sector, we have fuel storages, gas and electrical storages. And when we now want to solve the problem on the electric side, we might use power to heat and store the heat. We might have the e-mobility and store then in batteries in cars. We might have power to liquid to use it in the mobility sector. We might have power to gas to produce and store the gas and also maybe to reconvert to electricity back again, or using the gas in the heating sector, or we could use power to chemicals and store then the raw materials we have generated. We can use the gas in the mobility sector, and we can use the gas also in the chemistry sector. And of course, from the chemistry sector, again, we can produce fuels. So it is a highly interconnected system that would be perfect for solving storage in a cheap way. But now, why we are not doing that? Because we have a fear to read man or woman-made regulations. And I would like to start with the European Commission. In 1998, we had the unbundling regulation. That means we need to get more market, and therefore the generation had been separated from the transmission and distribution system. So our system only knows apples and pears. Either it is a generation unit or it is a transmission and distribution unit. And then it appears the banana and say, I'm a banana, but the European Commission says we don't have bananas, we only have apples and pears. So the banana is the energy storage. Energy storage does not exist in European regulation. So what does the regulatory body in our country say? The banana must become either a banable or it must become a piranha. And that makes everything complex. Everybody says we need storage, but from a regulation point of view, we are not allowed to have storages. So that makes it quite difficult. That is the result of a study that was being made together with a grid operator. When we have a grid bottleneck, then we can solve that with a storage, or we can solve that by building a new grid. And then we see, according to our regulation, when the length of the line is not too long, then just grid extension here is the better choice from an economic point of view. Or doing nothing and not transmitting the renewable power is quite often also a very attractive way from an economical side, and the battery solution is very poor. But when we allow a battery acting as a grid component and the same acting in the energy market to take advantage of cheap and low prices, then we have a complete different solution where the battery would be economically feasible without any subsidies. But regulation is a barrier in order to going there. Another barrier, and everybody knows, is taxation system. For example, the heating sector, when we have oil for burning, for heating our houses, the tax is very low, less than a Eurocent for a kilowatt hour. In the gas sector, it is almost 2.2 Eurocent. And when we come to the mobility sector, the fuel charge on taxis is already 7.3 cents for a kilowatt hour. And now we come to the electricity sector, and there we have fees and charges of 19 Eurocent for a kilowatt hour. And now you want to make the coupling of the energy sectors, want to use electricity, for example, in the heat or in the mobility sector. But even when you get electricity for free, you start with a burden of 19 Eurocent per kilowatt hour, and it's clear electricity with this regulation and taxation never can come into other energy sectors. It is very clear we need to get rid, not of the taxes, politicians will never lose their money for taxation, but we argue we need the same taxation for every kilowatt hour used, independently in which sector, but a taxation system that has grown over decades cannot be changed just because it would be sensible. Another thing, I'm not sure if anybody needs to pay value-added tax when growing tomatoes on the balcony before eating it. We not do either that in Germany, but when we generate our solar electricity on our roof, we pay all the taxes and fees. There are good arguments to do so, but when you operate a lignite power system, you are free of all those taxes. Again, a problem of taxation and fees. And then I have argued electricity storage battery is so expensive that we should avoid them. That is the success of batteries in Germany. In the last years, we have installed over 30,000 battery systems, mostly in private homes. And either the Germans are stupid people, that they do uneconomic installations, or they are very clever ones. And the regulation is a problem. So why are those people doing that? And I want to show our regulation on the pricing of electricity. It starts by generation, and when we look to the electricity exchange, maybe the price for a kilowatt hour is very low. It's maybe 2 or 3 or 4 cents per kilowatt hour. Then we charge a very CO2 charge of the European emissions trading system, almost been neglected. Then of course we have costs in the high voltage grid, medium voltage grid, low voltage grid. And then the electricity passes at the counter at our homes, and then we use the electricity at home. And when we look now the electricity price development along that change, that is what we have. That means when electricity passes the electricity counter, we have that mass of taxation and fees, and then the end we have finally 30 Eurocents, from 3 to 30 Eurocents. And there the battery, from an end user perspective, is a fantastic mean, because it avoids that the generated electricity on the roof goes to the grid, where the worth or the value of the electricity is almost nothing. So on a macroeconomic point of view, complete nonsense, but on the decision of the private house owner, a very sensible thing to do. So that spread of 3 cents to 30 cents is the problem, making the wrong decisions in the system for the energy transition. The fear of losses in the old car industry I also would like to talk about. It's the same development we at the moment see that we had in the renewable energy sector. That is in going for e-mobility. There's a strong discussion, is that a good or a bad development? And all the bars you see, the the data I have used for the bars are listed down there. And we just look for energy. The electric car is much better than the combustion engine car. Also, when we looked at on a lifetime basis, for sure, the electric car is much better than the one with a combustion engine. The CO2 emissions when we are driving still is on the positive side for the electric car, but for sure it strongly depends on what you assume on how the electricity is generated here. And then what we had recently seen, that was a study from the Swedish government, and that said, or what the German car industry said, what the study is telling, the battery is really an awful thing, and it makes electric cars worse than a combustion engine driven cars. Because in the manufacturing of a battery, there are so many CO2 emissions or CO2 equivalent emissions generated. And therefore, not anymore the electric car is better, it is now the one with the combustion engine. And again, it's a way of disinformation. I then read the Swedish study, and it says not that we should not go electric cars, but it gives a quite strong impact. They say, for example, the way Tesla is going with its enormous big battery capacity, that might be the wrong way, because not taking into account some Croatian professors driving from South Europe to North Europe, but the average car is just going a few kilometers per day, and therefore we don't need a battery big like that. We should go for much smaller batteries, but look for charging infrastructure that we can charge wherever we are standing for. So then, that was what our media and car industry did. They published in all media, electric cars are bad for the environment. And then we also can take into account that cars need to be produced. Unfortunately, what I found in literature, it's the same amount for electric cars and conventional cars. Here I have some doubts, because when I look to a nowadays car and I take away all the parts I don't need anymore in an electric car, it looks like that. Almost everything you find in a car that is in front here, you don't need anymore. Okay, it looks better when you still have the two tires, but then maybe it is almost true. That means all those parts we see here, we don't need anymore in an electric car. And that also fits to what a member of the board of BMW says. A combustion engine is composed of 1,200 parts, electric motor only of 17 pieces. And then it's the next argument where car industry says we cannot go for that. When we have cars using much less parts, we lose a lot of jobs. Again, the job argument, we lose a lot of jobs in the car industry. We should not go for an electric car. It's a danger for all our jobs. And car industry is really carrying on jobs, and that you see here on how cars are produced nowadays. You see a lot of people are working in car manufacturers. Really, jobs is what they care about. Maybe it's other arguments they have. But when doing the analysis on a complete way, we also need to take into account not only the battery needs to produce, also the fuel we fill to our cars needs to produce. And refineries are a very big energy consumer. And then again, when I take that into account, the combustion engine is worse. And there is a quite famous citation of Elon Musk, and he said, you have enough electricity to power all e-cars in the country if you stop refining gasoline. I think it's not completely true, but it is very close to be the same amount of energy needed. And that is now the comparison when we take a Tesla car with a quite big battery. When we do that with a Nissan Leaf, for example, and having also a bit of bigger driving range in the lifetime, the equivalent is much clearer towards the electric car. And most studies that are available, they always calculate with electricity generation that is by 50 to 70% of fossil fuel So when we go for renewable, all that discussion is obsolete because then we don't have those emissions in the electric cars anymore. So, and that is not a new discussion. We already had this discussion more than 100 years ago, and that was Kaiser Wilhelm II. He once said, "I believe in horses, the car is only a temporary phenomenon." And maybe that's the same discussion we have nowadays. Electric car is not a good way to go. We also created a new word in Germany, that is the Reichweitenangst. Maybe it will be also taken in the English language. That is the fear that we cannot drive a long enough distance before our car is stopping. And the Norwegian already have taken that word and translated in Norwegian language the Rekeweitenangst, because they have much more e-cars than we have in Germany, for example. Then we have the fear of removing old and climate hazardous subsidies. Due to time, I will not go to it in detail, but there's a study showing the German industry or German policy gives every year a 57 billion euro subsidies to climate hazardous industries. And I only give one example. For lignite, for example, we have many subsidies. I only want to highlight one. Normally we have a law when we take goods out of the earth, then the company that takes out those goods needs to pay between 10 and 40% of the market value of that good. There's one exception, it's lignite, then it's for free. And that is an enormous subsidy going close to €1 billion per year for an old technology we want to get rid of. And therefore, of those subsidies, we have a lot. So a lot of people, politicians, industry people speak, we need to go renewable, but they split, or they speak with split tongues, because what they talk and what they are doing action for is a completely different way. And then I would like to end my speech here with the outlook on the German Taliban. And maybe you remember when the Taliban did bomb the Bamiyan in Afghanistan, all the world was crying, how can they do that? Just 3 weeks ago, the German coal industry destroyed that dome here of Emirat, because beneath the dome there is coal they want to explore, but nobody even mentions, not in Germany, it is just not mentioned in media. And what I want to say, we researchers need to stop walking at the leash of industry and policy. We really need to involve ourselves into that fight. We not only stay on publishing papers, we need to involve ourselves in political decisions. And then I would end the citation of Mahatma Gandhi, and that is a positive one, and then you will win. Thank you very much. Muito obrigado.
Thank you, Ingo, for a very insightful presentation. It's time for questions. Yes, over there.
Thank you for a very interesting and inspiring presentation. Industries and governments are holding the money for our research. So, in fact, I see that more and more politicians are wanting to decide directly. In the past, more in the collegiates were deciding where to put the money on research. Though more and more it's being politicized. So how do you see that? So we will bite the hand that is feeding us, so what's going on?
I hope I did understand your question the right way. I'm not very sure, but you are right. The politicians are the ones who decide on funding research. And there is a strong funding in research, both on a national and on a European way for renewable power systems. That's true. Nevertheless, we still have also a lot of research still in our own country. We decided years ago to phase out of nuclear, but we still have nuclear research in our country. And we have the same kind of research also on a European level in different parts. So there is still research in many directions, not only in the one towards the renewable industry. And then research and what is really the way a country is going for in the energy economy, I think it's two different sides. When I look to the government area in Berlin, when I have sometimes talks there, politicians are always surrounded by lobbying people. Some researchers, but they are not so important because researchers don't have jobs, don't have money, but a lot of industry lobbyists, they try to push them. So I don't want to be a politician. One is steering on that arm, the other on that arm. They're not in an easy position.
Well, thank you for the talk. It was very nice. I really enjoyed it. But it really showed something that needs sustainability. I mean, it's really an integrated question of economics, environmental, and social. So, I mean, if you try to look at this outside of holistic manner, you really gonna have problems. What to think about? I mean, if you try to see only from the sides or the economic sides or the environmental side, forgetting the social, you can have really complicated issues to analyze in a holistic manner that.
Yeah, for sure, it's not an easy thing to do. Of course, we researchers in the renewable business always think on the environment and quite often don't think on the economy when energy is getting maybe more expensive, that it can destroy other businesses. For sure, there are a lot of interdependencies amongst each other. But nowadays, I think that is a good information. When I was a student, even I didn't believe that solar energy could be something for grid connection. I always thought that is something for isolated sites. But nowadays, solar energy and wind energy is one of the cheapest ways to produce electricity. Maybe we never thought on that issue many years ago. Nowadays, at least for energy, those formerly so incredible expensive ways to generate electricity, nowadays in many places of the world is the cheapest way to do it.
I agree completely. I'm just saying that this is an excellent example where the things must be integrated.
Yeah.
Thank you, Ingo, for a very inspiring presentation. Between Gandhi's two last phrases, then they fight you, then you win. I think between those two phrases, there's an important dynamics of organization, of organizing the actors and making the transition. So I would like to hear your views on how to mobilize those dynamics between the fighting, mobilizing, and then winning.
That's a good question. I don't have an answer for that. But it was my conclusion. I always thought when I was a young researcher, it's sufficient when you are teaching in university, when you write papers, when you give talks in a conference. But nowadays I'm convinced we should not just only talking amongst us ourselves here, researchers. We need to become an active part in the policy decision. It's horrible when you sometimes hear arguments of people who don't have any knowledge about energy.
I share your opinion about political process, but I see something else happening since 2008. The prices of renewables have fallen so much that the transition will happen for sure. Yeah. So now we are basically fighting dying industries, but there is a big difference from before 2008 when renewables were actually more expensive.
Yeah.
So in a way, developing countries are now moving maybe faster than developed countries because they need energy, they don't have vested interests, and they have limited amounts of money. A leader, a global leader in solar energy is Honduras. Unfortunately, we have nobody from Honduras here, but it's an interesting information. What is your comment on that? Have you been to Honduras? Maybe. Maybe it's Ingo who did that.
No, I haven't been to Honduras. But again, you're right. Those who need more energy and haven't gone maybe a wrong way now can directly go the way to renewables. On the other hand, when I had been visiting countries in Africa where we are maybe close to a dictatorship, even it is cheaper to producing electricity by wind and sun, they still spend a lot of their small money they have for importing oil and gas, because it's still a few making a big money of this import of energy sources. So it's still a good business for a few, even in the poorest country. And I think even there it is a fight. I'm not so optimistic.
I think with this we can conclude this session. Please join me in applauding Ingo for his excellent presentation. Also, thank you everybody for your contributions from the floor, and just announcement that the lunch is served in this building, and at 2 o'clock, at 1 o'clock we resign with the regular sessions, which will be held at the campus of chemical engineering. Thank you very much. Have a nice lunch.